Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I don't think I need that, Ralph. It's great to be here, particularly with Mr. Forbes and such a terrific team. Americans are being squeezed in the vice of stagnating wages and rising cost of living. And we're watching the American dream evaporate into myth because we're watching the loss of our liberties. You know, I've been in the conservative movement for a lot of years, folks, and for years I have heard over and over again about how government's getting bigger and government's getting larger. And we go to conservative conventions and we'll see videos of Ronald Reagan talking about how the only thing, the closest thing to immortality on earth is a government program. And he's right. But I've been hearing this for 40 years, 30 years, 25 years. And it's become boring because it doesn't stop. Because Republican, conservatives, libertarian, and even liberals rail about the size of government. And nobody's done anything about it. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger. We watch the national debt exploding to a staggering number of 17 trillion, one we cannot even fathom. We see massive government deficits. We watch our tax burden getting larger and larger, and the middle class being crushed. President Obama says the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. He blames capitalism. The rich are getting richer, and the middle class is getting squeezed. And the quality of life that many of us in this room have been accustomed to in the 50s and the 60s and 70s is diminishing. Not because of free market capitalism, but because of the failed policies of the Federal Reserve Bank that is debasing the American dollar, the very cornerstone of our economy. Let me turn you on to a little hint. There is no free market in this country, folks. It doesn't exist. I belong to an organization that worked very hard for years, many of you know, Americans for Prosperity, and advocating for free markets. Problem is we don't have a free market. And we cannot have a free market in this country as long as we have money that's controlled by central planners who determine its value, to decide how much we're going to produce. You know, there's one law of economics that every American knows, even if they didn't graduate high school. That's called supply and demand. The more you have of something, the less value it becomes. In the last decade, the supply of money, what's called the M1 money supply, the amount of cash and bank deposits out in the economy, went from $664 billion only a decade ago to $2.79 trillion today. That's an increase in the money supply over 400%. So what happens? The value of money decreases. We have a Federal Reserve Bank that prints money out of thin air, out of nowhere. In fact, we don't even have the value of money being printed out of thin air because they just make digital deposits in the accounts of the big banks. So you don't even have those pieces of paper. So the American dollar, that sacred piece of, that sacred little document, call it, or note that we held so dear, that we trust and believe in, this piece of paper, which was once backed by real value. You know, there was a time years ago that you would walk into the bank, you could walk into the bank with your dollar bill and get your share of silver or silver coin, or redeem it for something called gold. The top of a bill used to say silver certificate. You might, some of us remember that, or what have you. Now it's a Federal Reserve note. Redeemable for what? Redeemable for what assets the Federal Reserve has. I would argue that you can take your Federal Reserve note, go into the bank and ask for your fair share of a subprime mortgage portfolio. Because that's basically all it is. Say, Mr. Banker, can I have that piece of that house that's underwater? You know, in the years, and I don't want to get into the depths of economic lessons. We know in our hearts, Americans know right now that there's a problem. They know there's a problem with this country. We're watching the American dream slip away. We've become accustomed to interest rates that are so low that an American saver who's worked hard and saved all their lives can't get a return on their income. We're accustomed to mediocre, high unemployment rates, kids coming out of college and living in their families' homes. That's the new norm. But that's not the American dream. And that's not the way it should be. If we had real money, if we had money backed by gold, if we did not have this exploding ability to print money out of thin air by a bunch of central planners, we'd have real economic prosperity just like we had in this country for the 40 years prior to Richard Nixon's ending the gold standard in 1971. You know, I grew up in the 60s, and we used to play like millionaire games, right? I came from a blue-collar working family, and the idea of having $1 million was phenomenal. I mean, if you saved $1 million, then you were rich, and nobody could tell you what to do. And there used to be that show, remember a show back in the 60s called The Millionaire, where a guy would walk and hand somebody $1 million, and people were like so happy. If you've worked hard in this country and you've saved, like my mom's in a nursing home right now. Single mother, my dad died when I was a kid. She actually worked not far from here for 35 years at St. Vincent's Hospital, scrimped and saved and lived the kind of frugal life that we learn to be as Americans, to accumulate capital. Save $1 million. Go to the bank. Put your $1 million in a safe bank FDIC insured CD for $1 million, and your interest rate's about $10,000 a year. That's not enough money to pay your rent. It's not enough money to have a decent life. You'll eat away at that save. And why? Because the Federal Reserve Bank is keeping interest rates at a rate so low that a saver is now relegated to being obsolete. We don't need savers in this country anymore. Why should we? Why do we need savers to save money and put money in the bank so that the bankers can loan it and pay us a fair interest? The Fed can just print it out of nowhere. And that's a tragedy, because at the base of free market capitalism is the ability to save money, accumulate capital to invest in the means of production. When savers become obsolete, so goes the free market. When workers' wages remain stagnant, when the cost of living increases higher than their increases in salaries, whether it's laborers and labor union workers or government workers, so goes the middle class. The battle ahead, the single most important battle in this country, is to take back the value of our money. And there was a time not long ago, folks, that Americans took the value of their money very, very seriously. Ralph Banco spoke about this. You may not realize this, but back in 1904, in the wake of those campaigns which were argued over monetary policy of William Jennings Bryan, Frank Baum wrote a little story called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Americans engaged in monetary policy. The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was a metaphor on monetary policy, Oz being an ounce of gold. The path, the yellow brick road being the gold standard. In the original book, Dorothy, who was the average American's slippers, were silver. Americans engaged in this debate because they understood the danger of paper money. I ran last year, as many of you know, in a pretty tough and dynamic campaign for the U.S. Senate. When I came off of that race, I needed to decompress, and I wanted to go back and do some reading. So I pulled an old book off the shelves I had read years ago, and I'm at that point in my life where I appreciate now better the classics I was forced to read in high school. It was called The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. But go down to the fourth paragraph, where in that terrific novel about the tragedies of the terror of the French Revolution, Charles Dickens, in one sentence, explains what brought on the social upheaval that was the French Revolution. Dickens writes, France had engaged in the printing of money and spending it, destroying the value of the French franc, driving up the cost of commodities for the middle class, and causing a social revolution. In Hungary, early part of the last century, we saw Hungarian money collapse into nothing, being shoveled into sewers. We saw the German Deutschmark crash and burn. In Zimbabwe, not long ago, a once vibrant economy in the 80s, through the printing of money, Zimbabwe watched their money collapse. But in all of these countries, in the last 100 years, when their money collapsed, they had another money to fall back on, the American dollar. What happens when the American dollar collapses? I'm not predicting its collapse. There's no proof to say that's going to happen in the near future. That would be apocalyptic. But if you're a middle-class family and your home is in foreclosure and you're out of work, you're living in your own little apocalypse. See, in free market capitalism, it's about millions of people making decisions that are best for them. It's the catalytics of economic growth. And when you pick away one at a time in each individual over time, you diminish the economy and you become accustomed to a new norm of low unproductivity and a diminished American dream. Regaining and recapturing the value of the American dollar, taking control of our money away from the central planners and giving back to Americans, as, by the way, is designated in the United States Constitution under Section 8, Article 1, which states that Congress is responsible for the coinage of money and determining its value, not some pseudo-public entity, mysterious group called the Federal Reserve System. It's Congress's responsibility, and they've abdicated that responsibility. We have a job as Americans. We're going to launch that job right here today at this restaurant. The reason we're here is that in 1904, this was built as the Real Estate Bank of New York. Railroad tracks were laid to right from the harbor up to this point to bring these vaults that you're looking at so that they could store gold and silver in these vaults to back up the money, the notes that they were issuing prior to the reform of the Federal Reserve Bank. This is the single most important issue this nation is facing. Without control of your savings, you don't control your liberty. Without control of your money, you don't control the value of your wages and your labor. With giving control of our money to bureaucrats, we give up control of our economy and our destiny. We cannot allow that to happen. So we have work to do. What I'm going to do, what you and I are going to do with Fix the Dollar through our American Principles in Action effort, we are going to get out to states like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Florida, and we're going to force these candidates who want to be president of the United States, both Democrat and Republican, to take positions on this issue. We want congressmen and senators to understand and take positions on this issue. I'll tell you right now that what they're saying is, well, we don't hear about this from our constituents, so they're going to hear about it now. We have an issue that goes to the heart and soul what every working mom, working guy, and family and businessman understands, the value of their money. We need to make this the number one candidate, the number one issue for our candidates for president. And we need a president in the White House who's going to put an end to the madness, unbounded printing of money by the Federal Reserve Bank and reestablish a gold standard. Let's lift that torch behind aside the golden door, and as the great poem on the Statue of Liberty says, and restore a golden opportunity for the future of this country. That's why we're here today. I hope you'll join in this effort. It is the single biggest effort we're going to see in the decades to come. Thank you for being here.